For most of the summer, the Jalen Duren situation seemed completely boxed into three possibilities. Detroit could give him a max extension, send him to Sacramento in a sign-and trade, or watch him take the qualifying offer and enter unrestricted free agency next summer. Golden State wasn't part of the conversation at all. There wasn't a single report or insider connecting the Warriors to Detroit in this situation. Then, at 1:17 this afternoon, Shams CHARANIA revealed that the actual negotiations have been happening far outside the scenarios everybody had been following. Jalen Duren has now been traded from the Detroit Pistons to the Golden State Warriors. And the crazy part is that Golden State apparently started working on this long before anybody knew they were even involved. Shams explained that the Warriors front office contacted Detroit directly weeks ago, well before this became public. That timing matters because Detroit was internally weighing Ausar Thompson's extension against Duren's situation, creating an opening for a private deal if somebody brought the right package. While Sacramento had been publicly pursuing Duren, Golden State quietly approached the Pistons with a different type of offer. Mike Dunleavy Jr. and the Warriors staff reportedly constructed a package built around legitimate draft compensation and expiring salary. That gave Detroit immediate financial flexibility without forcing the complicated multi-team structure that other scenarios reportedly required. Once Detroit saw the offer, the Pistons acted quickly. And that's the detail Shams emphasized because Golden State's pursuit started weeks before the public speculation even began. So, while everyone else was debating Sacramento, Detroit, and the qualifying offer, the Warriors were apparently working on their own path behind the scenes. Even people within Detroit's front office were reportedly surprised that Golden State ultimately became the destination. Then, just 14 minutes after Shams' report, Draymond Green made a post that made the reason for this move pretty clear. Draymond specifically talked about adding a real rim runner who can set legitimate screens, protect the paint, and finish above defenders in transition. He also pointed directly to defensive rebounding as something the Warriors have been missing in their front court for years. That's what makes the post stand out. Draymond wasn't simply celebrating the arrival of a recognizable player. He was identifying a specific, long-standing weakness on the roster and explaining exactly how this move could address it. And coming from one of the league's most tactically minded players, that level of detail makes the reaction even more notable. Here's where the entire story takes that crazy turn, because Golden State wasn't even in the public conversation. Every report had Detroit retaining Duren or Sacramento acquiring him through sign-and trade, yet the Warriors somehow ended up making the deal happen. The reason is that the public never saw the same process that was happening between the two front offices. Sacramento's pursuit became visible because there were constant insider reports, executive comments, and other information leaking across multiple outlets. Golden State took the opposite approach and kept its interest extremely quiet, relying on direct communication with Detroit instead of public negotiations. So, while the basketball media was focused on Sacramento, Golden State had already been doing meaningful work with Detroit weeks earlier. And once you look at what Duren actually brings, the Warriors' interest starts making a lot more sense. There are three major reasons behind this move, and the third one is tied directly to the timeline Shams revealed. First, Golden State's championship identity has always depended on movement, off-ball action, and dribble handoffs around the elbow. What they've consistently lacked is a truly athletic rim runner who can finish above the rim, set physical screens, and give them a different kind of interior presence.
Even after a difficult postseason, Duren remains one of the league's most efficient interior finishers. That makes him the kind of low-maintenance, efficient frontcourt player this system has theoretically been built to maximize but hasn't consistently had available. The second piece is defense, specifically defensive rebounding. That's been a persistent structural issue for Golden State over the last several seasons, and Duren's combination of strong rebounding numbers and interior physicality directly addresses it. He gives Steve Kerr's staff the type of possession-ending presence they haven't consistently had when it comes to securing the defensive glass. Now, before we get to that third reason, let me know in the comments whether Duren's rough postseason concerns you enough to outweigh how efficient he was during the regular season, because this is supposed to be a championship-ready roster, and that postseason performance is obviously part of the conversation. But reason number 3 is the timeline. Shams said Golden State reached out to Detroit directly weeks before this became a public story. Think about that for a second. The Warriors identified a quiet opportunity, started working on it privately, and made their move before most of the league even realized Duren was realistically available to a team like Golden State. The timeline is what makes Golden State's involvement so difficult to dismiss, because an insider establishing that the Warriors' interest existed before the entire public rumor cycle points to actual access to private front office conversations. That's very different from a reporter simply connecting the dots after everyone else already knew Duren was available. And Stephen A. Smith had a hard time accepting that exact part of the story on air. He pointed out that nobody had Golden State involved, not one insider and not one report, while Sacramento had reportedly been pursuing Duren for months. Stephen A. wanted to see actual details before believing that the Warriors somehow won a race nobody even knew they were running. And honestly, that skepticism is understandable considering how strongly Sacramento had been presented as the likely sign-and-trade destination. But there's another side to it. Golden State's championship era has spent its career finding complementary pieces that make an already successful roster more complete, often by moving quietly before a public bidding war can develop. That's why the Warriors contacting Detroit before the broader Duren rumors even started matters so much. It suggests this wasn't simply Golden State reacting after Duren became publicly available, but rather an early decision based on their own conviction. There's also a personal side to Duren's situation that shouldn't get lost. Duren wanted to stay in Detroit long-term, and his college coach, Penny Hardaway, publicly said that remaining there was very important to him. He wasn't demanding a trade or publicly forcing his way out. This was a young center who believed Detroit could become his long-term home, only for an internal roster decision to change that path without him controlling the outcome. Now he has landed with Golden State, despite never specifically campaigning to go there, and there is a real challenge waiting for him. Duren is entering a demanding championship environment where expectations will immediately be high, despite no advanced role in choosing the organization he joined. At 22 years old, he also has to prove himself after documented playoff struggles exposed weaknesses in his game just months ago against Cleveland. To understand why this move happened, you have to go back through the contract standoff that defined his summer. Duren became eligible for a maximum extension after earning All-NBA third-team honors following a breakout season. He averaged 19.15 points and 10.12 rebounds while shooting an incredible 65% from the field across 70 games.
That production came on a Detroit team that won 60 games and finished as the top seed in the Eastern Conference. So heading into the offseason, Duren wasn't simply another young player looking for a new deal. He had a legitimate case for a maximum extension, which is exactly why the situation became such a major storyline. The contract standoff never really got closer, with Detroit's early offers reportedly sitting around $35 to $38 million per year, while Duren's camp was looking for the 30% maximum salary. That difference stayed in place throughout the summer. But the money wasn't the only issue, because Duren's postseason performance created another major concern. After averaging 19.15 points and 10.12 rebounds during the regular season, his numbers dropped to just 10.2 points and 8.5 rebounds over 14 playoff starts. The most troubling moment came during Detroit's second-round series against Cleveland, when Duren was benched for the entire overtime period, in a game the Pistons eventually lost by 4 points. A decision like that in an elimination-adjacent situation is exactly the type of warning sign that can make another front office hesitate before committing major money. Then there's the Ausar Thompson situation, which made the entire process even more complicated. Because Duren was a restricted free agent, another team could make him an offer sheet, but Detroit would still have the ability to match it. That's why even teams that showed interest earlier in the summer, including the Lakers before they eventually pivoted to Walker Kessler, never actually completed an offer sheet. The structure of the situation made a direct trade the more realistic way to get Duren out of Detroit. And then you have Ausar Thompson, whose own contract situation became a major factor in Detroit's decision. Thompson became eligible for an extension this past month, with an October deadline approaching. Detroit reportedly viewed Thompson as the better long-term two-way player, creating a significant financial conflict between the two young players. Giving Duren the kind of money he was asking for would have limited Detroit's ability to pay Thompson, especially if the front office had already decided Thompson was the better long-term investment for this roster. Now, look at what Golden State offers Duren from a development standpoint. The Warriors have spent years building a championship-tested structure capable of developing complementary players and giving different types of players defined roles. If Duren needs to rebuild his confidence after that difficult playoff stretch, Golden State has the kind of established system that could help him do it. From the Warriors' perspective, this move also fits the way they've operated during their championship era. They found a high-efficiency rim runner at a reasonable acquisition cost because another organization had its own internal financial priorities.
That's the type of market opportunity Golden State has consistently tried to identify, getting involved early before another team can come in and offer more. But even with all of that, we still have to be honest about the basketball fit. It would be irresponsible to look only at the upside of this move without acknowledging the legitimate concerns that come with it. The biggest question with Duren is how his current limitations translate to Golden State's offense. Right now, he's still a limited shooter and ball handler, which matters a lot in a motion-heavy system built around spacing and constant movement. Steve Kerr's staff will have to make intentional adjustments so those weaknesses don't interfere with the offensive structure the Warriors depend on. And adding a starting caliber center naturally creates another issue because the rest of the front court rotation is going to change. Other bigs on the roster could see their minutes or responsibilities shift, and that's something worth watching as the coaching staff settles on its rotation for a team carrying legitimate championship expectations.
For Duren personally, this move also changes a career path that had been heading in a very different direction. Detroit selected him 13th overall out of Memphis in 2022, and during his rookie seasons, he became an important part of the Pistons' rebuild. He played significant minutes through some of Detroit's toughest seasons, eventually seeing that patience pay off when the team won 60 games last year. So being traded after finally helping the franchise reach meaningful success is obviously a major turn in his career. As recently as this spring, it looked like Duren and Detroit could be building toward a long-term partnership, which makes the move even more bittersweet. From Detroit's perspective, though, the restricted free agency rules gave them control over the situation. They had matching rights on any offer sheet, which meant another team couldn't simply sign Duren away without Detroit having the opportunity to match. That leverage is what allowed the Pistons to pursue a trade instead of potentially watching him leave through the qualifying offer route next summer. Getting draft compensation and expiring salary gives Detroit something tangible in return while also creating the financial room they needed. That matters because Detroit reportedly wanted to make sure it could comfortably extend Ozar Thompson without creating the luxury tax complications that paying both players significant money could bring. Golden State obviously gets the player it wanted, but Detroit's side of the transaction has a clear financial purpose as well. And then there's Stephen Curry, whose interest in this type of frontcourt piece has been pretty clear. Curry has talked about wanting a reliable interior player who can finish easy lobs, grab defensive rebounds, and contribute without needing a large number of offensive touches. That's exactly the kind of complementary presence that can give Golden State's offensive stars more freedom, instead of forcing them to compensate for a smaller and less physical frontcourt. But for this trade to actually deliver what the Warriors are expecting, several things have to go right. Duren is still a young center with documented playoff limitations. He's entering an entirely new system on a compressed timeline, and Kerr's staff will have to make defensive adjustments around his game. All of those pieces have to come together for this move to have the kind of impact Golden State is clearly betting on during its championship push. At the same time, one difficult playoff run doesn't automatically define a young center's entire career. There are current all-star centers who struggled during their first real postseason experiences before becoming dependable playoff performers as they gained experience and matured physically and mentally. So Duren's rough playoff showing is a legitimate concern, but it doesn't necessarily determine what he becomes from here. Golden State has another reason to feel encouraged because its championship-era coaching staff has already shown an ability to develop young talent inside a structured system. That gives Duren a legitimate opportunity to move past one difficult playoff stretch instead of treating it as a permanent limit on what he can become. Detroit also had a very real roster problem that made this trade practical from its side. Had Duren returned, reports indicated the Pistons would have had 16 players on standard contracts, meaning difficult roster decisions were coming regardless of what happened with his contract. Trading Duren solves that roster crunch while also helping Detroit deal with the Ozar Thompson extension situation. So the Pistons gain meaningful flexibility across multiple roster decisions at the same time. For Golden State, this move says something about how seriously the front office is treating the remaining championship window. The Warriors could have simply kept their existing roster together and relied on continuity and internal development. Instead, they quietly pursued a specific player deep into the offseason and actually got the deal done.
That shows the organization wasn't willing to simply accept whatever roster remained after free agency slowed down. Now, the immediate question shifts to Golden State's existing big men. Adding Duren creates real competition for frontcourt minutes, especially for whoever had previously been expected to start at center. The coaching staff will have to sort through that competition during camp rather than assuming Duren automatically receives the starting job.
And that's part of the risk attached to this entire move. Golden State is bringing in a young center with documented playoff struggles, asking him to learn a completely new system on a short timeline, while also competing with established rotation players for minutes. All of those factors have to work together if Duren is going to provide the impact the Warriors are expecting. The talent and regular season production make the move promising, but those variables can't simply be ignored because the upside looks good. And now that Golden State has made this significant front-court addition this late in the offseason, the next question is what it does to the balance of the Western Conference. What makes this move so important is the way Golden State has suddenly made the rest of the conference rethink how this roster can be defended. The Warriors already had an elite offensive system, and now they've added meaningful size and rebounding to it. That changes the actual difficulty of preparing for this team over a demanding regular season, and eventually a playoff run. Jalen Duren joining the Warriors stands out because he gives this championship-era group the efficient rim runner it has been missing for years. And the fact that Golden State was quietly pursuing him early matters too, because that points toward deliberate front office conviction instead of some last-second reaction. Sham's detailed timeline only adds to that, showing that there was legitimate sourcing behind how this entire deal came together. Meanwhile, while everybody else was focused on a completely different situation, Draymond's tactically specific response made it clear this was about fixing an actual structural weakness. In other words, this isn't simply Golden State collecting another recognizable name just for the sake of adding one. The bigger question now is what happens next if Duren really does land in the Bay. Detroit's draft compensation becomes the immediate thing to watch, along with how quickly Kerr's staff can establish a completely different front-court role for him. That becomes even more important considering his documented recent postseason struggles. I've got a read on that part that might catch you off guard, and that's where we're going next, so make sure you're subscribed. Everybody had their eyes on Sacramento, but this whole time the real deal was developing somewhere completely different. There is also something bigger about this move when you look at how championship-level front offices search for value even after they've already reached the top. Golden State has repeatedly shown a willingness to recognize market inefficiencies created by another team's financial limitations and act before competing teams can realistically catch up. That kind of institutional discipline is what keeps a dynasty relevant instead of leaving it as a team that simply got hot once and never managed to recreate it. But there is another side of this trade that deserves attention, especially for Cade Cunningham. Cunningham and Duren had developed genuine chemistry over several seasons, including during that 60-win campaign. So removing such an established front-court partner this late in the offseason creates a significant adjustment for Detroit's franchise cornerstone. That matters even more with a new season approaching, where continuity can be enormously important. And that's really the final piece of this entire trade to keep in mind.